I am a teacher at Columbine High School. There is a student here with a gun.
He's inside the school shooting at the gun!
So I had to do it because somebody had to do something.
After shooting in the theater, I didn't have a plan of whether to die or not.
Hi everybody, welcome back to the channel, or welcome if you're new. We apologize for the lack of uploads recently. We took a break after our recent labor-intensive videos. We are happy to be back though, and hope you are having or had an amazing Halloween. Before getting into it, we wanted to thank our members for voting to cover this case for October. This is truly such a horrific case, one that we didn't know too much about prior to our research. The killing spree we're going to go over would ultimately inspire one of the most well-known, memorable, and iconic horror movies of all time, Scream, which came out 6 years after the fact, in 1996. In August of 1990, the city of Gainesville, Florida was stunned by the incredibly gruesome murders of 5 young college students that had taken place over the course of only 4 days. However, these 5 murders weren't the only crimes connected to this case, as authorities would later come to find out. Ultimately, they would land their suspicions on a man named Daniel Rowling. As always, let's start by looking into his life prior to the events of the case. Daniel Harold Rowling, who also went by Danny, was born on May 26, 1954. His father, James, was a police officer in the city that they lived in, Shreveport, Louisiana. Along with this, he was a decorated veteran of the Korean War. Danny's mother, Claudia, reportedly became pregnant with him only 2 weeks into her marriage with James, which disgusted him greatly. It's reported that James beat Claudia throughout her pregnancy, which ultimately ended with her leaving him. Unfortunately, that didn't last long, with her returning to him before she gave birth. James apparently did not want children, so the birth of their first son unsurprisingly did not make him happy in the slightest. Danny's father made sure he knew it too, constantly reminding him all throughout his life that he was unwanted and useless. As could be predicted, James showed little to no affection towards Danny, stating that it was, quote, sissy stuff to hug his son. Not long after Danny turned 1, the couple had another baby boy, who they named Kevin, making Danny an older brother. It's reported that following the birth of his younger brother, the abuse towards Danny escalated. Danny and Kevin's childhoods were anything but safe and sound. Their dad was obviously a massively abusive person, taking his anger out on his wife and their 2 kids for even the littlest issue. It is reported, though, that despite the whole family suffering at the hands of James, Danny was the one who got it the worst. The first instance of physical abuse towards Danny was said to have taken place when he was only a little over 1 year old. James was apparently displeased with the way that Danny was crawling around, so like any sane person would think to do, he decided to beat his young son. This kind of mistreatment continued throughout the following years. Along with the physical abuse, I read that James did not allow his kids to celebrate holidays, or even their birthdays. There is mention, though, of Danny receiving Christmas presents in his teen years, so I'm unsure if the ban on celebrating holidays was only when he was a child, or if it only applied to holidays other than Christmas. When Danny was 4 years old, his mother, Claudia, attempted to leave her violent husband and actually successfully stayed away for 6 months. Unfortunately, James was able to convince her to come back, and so she did. When Danny was 5 years old, his father brought a puppy home. Danny immediately bonded with the dog and grew very close to it. Unfortunately, his father's abuse extended to the new addition, and James would reportedly beat the puppy constantly, according to their neighbors, and Danny himself. The repeated, relentless abuse to the animal ultimately ended up injuring the dog so badly that it passed away in Danny's arms. This could have been his first brush with death. Throughout the years following, Claudia attempted to leave James several times, which always proved to be unsuccessful. She, along with Danny and Kevin, would stay away for sometimes months at a time, but would always eventually return to James, despite Danny's pleas not to. When he was 11 years old, he witnessed an argument between his parents, which led to his mother slitting her own wrists before locking herself in the bathroom. She was admitted to the hospital and ultimately recovered from her wounds. After this incident, even at this young age, Danny began to use drugs and alcohol. Throughout Danny's pre-teen and teen years, James would use his status as a police officer to throw his son in jail, and once even left him there for 2 weeks after he was caught drinking with a friend. On another occasion, James pinned Danny to the ground, handcuffed him, and had his fellow officers come and take Danny away, all because he had supposedly embarrassed his father. In his early to mid-teens, Danny began to peep into neighbors' windows, watching as the happy families inside spent time together. As he got older, he did this with the hope of catching a glimpse of naked girls. He was eventually caught doing this, and unsurprisingly, was beaten by his father relentlessly. It was also at this time in his life that James tied Danny up several times, which became a very common form of punishment for not only him, but also his younger brother Kevin. I read that Danny and his father got into a serious physical altercation when he was 16 years old, leading him to be put in a juvenile detention center. After he was released, he decided to drop out of school. Danny's grades were never great, and he had actually fallen behind in previous years. As he grew older, his motivation to attend school declined dramatically, which led to him dropping out. He did, however, end up getting his high school equivalent. After leaving school, Danny attempted to join the Navy, but failed the enlistment test. Instead, he was able to join the Air Force and was stationed out of state. During his time in the Air Force, Danny experimented with several drugs including LSD, and was said to have used it more than 100 times. He was eventually locked up for drug possession, disobeying orders, and was also diagnosed with a personality disorder. Following his release, he was discharged from the Air Force. After returning to Shreveport in 1973, Danny, now 19, began attending church, where he met his first wife, 19-year-old Omather Loomis. Their marriage wasn't great right off the bat, as Danny turned out to be abusive just like his father, even threatening Omather's life several times. In 1975, the couple found out that they were expecting a child, a baby girl who they named Kylie Danielle when she was born later that year. Following her birth, Danny fell off of the wagon. He found it incredibly difficult to be a husband and father, with the family regularly barely having enough money to survive. Because of this stress, Danny began abusing drugs and alcohol worse than before. His behavior also turned erratic, and according to Omather, Danny would disappear in the evenings with absolutely no explanation. When she finally confronted Danny about his behavior, he physically assaulted her, leaving her with a black eye. One night, 2 police officers came to the door, asking where Danny was, stating to his wife, Omather, that they had gotten several reports of him peeping into neighbors' windows. Unfortunately, I wasn't really able to find any more information regarding this. Either way, of course, Danny and his wife would fight often, but there was a particularly bad incident when she threatened to leave him, and Danny reportedly pointed a shotgun to Omather's head, threatening to kill her. He also threatened the life of her ex-boyfriend after he found out they were talking again, and even apparently attacked him at one point. Omather finally got the courage to take their child and leave Danny, but eventually returned when he promised that things would change. This turned out to be a lie, and she then moved out again, this time filing for divorce, which reportedly crushed Danny. It wasn't long until Danny committed his first sexual assault, targeting a woman who resembled Omather. At this point in time, Danny was in his early to mid-20s and was working at a bakery. One day at work, he accidentally cut off a good chunk of one finger and possibly a smaller amount of another finger on his left hand. Remember this detail for later in the case, as it comes up again. Not long after this incident, Danny was involved in a serious car accident, which resulted in another person passing away, a fact which was said to have tormented Danny. With this now compounding with his intense feeling of loneliness after his wife left him, Danny decided to commit a string of crimes and spent the following several years in and out of jail. His crimes included many separate armed robberies throughout Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. Sources vary on the year, but it's reported that in the summer of 1988 or 1989, Danny, now in his mid-30s, moved back in with his parents after being paroled from prison. From here on out, I will be referring to Danny by his last name, Rowling. On November 4th, 1989, Rowling committed his first murders. He had reportedly followed a young woman home with the intention of killing her. Unfortunately for him, the attack wouldn't be so easy, as she wasn't alone in the house. 55-year-old William Grissom, his daughter, 24-year-old Julie Grissom, whom Rowling was targeting, and her nephew, 8-year-old Sean Grissom, were all at William's house, which was about 10 minutes away from Rowling's parents' home in Shreveport. According to Sean's father, the 8-year-old boy was over at the home for the weekend to celebrate his recent birthday with his grandpa and aunt. The three family members were spending quality time together before Rowling entered the home through an unlocked door and attacked them, ending all of their lives. The gruesome assault seemed to have taken place as dinner was being prepared, as there were steaks found on the grill in the backyard when the bodies were later discovered. Backing up again, after Rowling entered the home and attacked William and Sean, he sexually assaulted Julie before killing her and posing her body. 2 days after the attacks, on the following Monday, after Sean's mother learned he hadn't made it to school, she desperately attempted to get a hold of either William or Julie. Unable to, she quickly contacted the police to voice her concerns about her son's well-being. Authorities got a hold of William's neighbors and requested that they go check on the family. One of the neighbors did and noticed that the newspaper was still sitting untouched at the end of the driveway. As he walked up to the house, he also noticed that the lights inside were on. When he arrived at the door leading to the home's utility room, he attempted to push on it, but was unable to get it opened fully, as there was an object blocking it. The neighbor took a peek to see what the object was, and that's when he saw a motionless body pressed against the door. Upon this discovery, the authorities were notified immediately. It was found that William's body was the one slumped up against the door. He had sustained several stab wounds to his back and chest. Once inside the home, investigators discovered Sean's body lying face down in the middle of the family room. It's reported that he had been watching TV when he was attacked. He suffered a single stab wound that entered through his back and exited through his chest. And finally, Julie's body was found in her room. She was partly nude, and her legs were left dangling off of the bed. Though she had been stabbed at least 3 times in the back, her body was intentionally positioned to be facing up and was said to be in a sexually degrading pose. It was found that at some point, vinegar had been applied to her body in what authorities believed was an attempt to wash away evidence. Also found on her body was duct tape residue. The tape was used to restrain Julie. Remember these details for later. The clothes that were forcibly taken off of her were found in the home and had seemingly been washed by the killer. There were no signs of forced entry found. However, the investigation did note that there was an indication of at least a small struggle, though the scene was neat for the most part. No items were taken from the home either, which told police that this attack was most likely not connected to a robbery. While all 3 family members were killed in the same way, authorities believe that Julie alone was the intended target of whoever committed the attacks. Obviously, her body was the only one intentionally posed in a shocking way, and she had also been the only one to be seemingly cleaned, which suggested that the killer might have left behind more evidence on her, hinting that he had spent more time with her. The murders unfortunately would go on to become a cold case for the time being. In May of 1990, about 6 months after his first murders, Rowling and his father got into a serious altercation. It's reported that the argument began with his father, James, telling Rowling to make sure his car's windows were up when it began to rain. According to an official document, James fired a few shots before Rowling retrieved his own pistol and came back into the house, saying, quote, "Old man, you want to shoot it out?" Rowling then shot his father in the head and stomach. Miraculously, James survived both wounds, though he did end up losing an eye and an ear. Rowling then fled the home and began his escape. At some point that evening, Rowling entered a home in the same city and robbed a couple of a whopping $21, apparently saying he needed it to get to Dallas. Rowling eventually left Shreveport and instead began the 12-hour journey down to Gainesville, Florida, where a new semester at the university was just beginning. On the way there, he stopped in Tallahassee, Florida, where he purchased a K-bar knife. Later, in Sarasota, he purchased a handgun under the name of Michael Kennedy in late July. The person who sold him the gun later said that the buyer had one distinctive feature: a missing finger. Weirdly, Rowling would never use the firearm in any of his later murders. It was also here that he later admitted to sexually assaulting a woman, who later came forward, and her name was Janet Frake. On August 5th, 1990, the masked Rowling had broken into her home while she was away and attacked her with his recently purchased knife when she arrived back. Janet thankfully managed to stay calm, and after Rowling reportedly told her that the assault would last all night, she offered him a beer and a break. She later stated, quote, "He went from one of the meanest, scariest, most violent sons of bitches you could ever imagine to being really calm and relaxed. He at one point laid his knife on her lap and asked if he could take his mask off, to which she declined, not wanting to see his face in fear that it would lead him to kill her. She later said, quote, "I don't know why he asked permission about the mask. It was almost like I was his girlfriend now. You know what he told me? He said, 'You would really like to date me if the circumstances were different.'" After talking for a while, Janet suggested that Rowling leave. Knowing that he had previously and would later leave his victims deceased, it's surprising that he actually agreed. Janet stated, quote, "The last thing he said was, 'Would you do me a favor? Would you give me 10 minutes before you call the cops?' And just like that, he vanished into the night." When he arrived in Gainesville, it seems as though he got a hotel room from August 18th to the 23rd, also under the name of Michael Kennedy. After that, he began camping out in the wooded areas around the city. Soon, his murderous rampage would begin, terrorizing the town in the process. Two freshman girls, 18-year-old Sonia Larson and 17-year-old Christina Powell, were so excited for the next stage of their lives. They had met recently and decided to share a home for the upcoming school year. Originally, they attempted to get into an on-campus dormitory. However, they were all full at the time, so the girls instead had to live off campus. Sonia's mother, Ada, did not like the fact that they were not going to be living on campus, as it was less secure and safe. But with no other option, she had to accept it. Just days after the pair moved into their new home, they became the first of the victims that later earned Rowling the nickname, the Gainesville Ripper. In the early morning hours of August 24th, Rowling made entry to the girls' apartment through an unlocked door and brutally attacked both of them as they slept. According to a later interrogation with Rowling, he first went downstairs and stood over Christina as she slept on the couch. He then directed his attention upstairs and targeted Sonia, who was up there sleeping in her bedroom at the time. He recalled stabbing her multiple times, while also pressing tape against her mouth to muffle her screams. According to him, the entire attack lasted about 30 seconds before she succumbed to her wounds. Then, he made his way downstairs and turned his focus on Christina. Again, he pressed tape over her mouth, and after tying her hands behind her back, he took her clothes off and sexually assaulted her. After that, he laid her on the floor and proceeded to stab her in the back, also killing her in the process. He also used his knife to mutilate her body. He then went back upstairs, removed the tape from Sonia's body, and also took her underwear off, but did not sexually assault her. Rowling made his way back downstairs, into the kitchen, and retrieved a cleaner, which he then proceeded to insert into Christina's body in an attempt to flush out any evidence from the previous sexual assault. Satisfied with his work, Rowling went to the kitchen again and enjoyed an apple and a banana as a snack before leaving the scene. On August 26th, after not hearing from Sonia and Christina for a little while, and being unable to get a hold of them, Christina's family headed over to the home to check on them. Unable to get a response at the door after banging on it repeatedly, they enlisted the help of the complex's maintenance man to get into the house. The complex's manager, Betty Kernett, also showed up to the scene, but before entering, they requested the police to accompany them. Betty later stated, quote, "When he went in, I followed him in the apartment and I saw the young lady on the bed. You could see she was in a bad position, and I just turned around and walked out. My maintenance man, unfortunately, ran down the stairs screaming, 'Oh my God,' and came out and threw up. And the sad part about it is that we had the parents behind us on the stairs. They had found Sonia's bloody body posed in a sexually degrading way on her bed. She had been pulled to the edge, with her legs draped over the side at the knee, and her arms positioned above her head. Her shirt was bunched up around her neck and had several sharp slashes in it, which lined up with her multiple stab wounds, suggesting she was wearing her shirt normally during the attack. According to some of the court documents, her injuries consisted of numerous stab wounds to her right arm, some of which went completely through, and at least 7 stab wounds to her chest, some of which penetrated both her lungs and heart. She also had a slash wound to her thigh. The medical examiner later stated that the wounds to her arm were consistent with someone trying to defend themselves after just waking up. On her mouth, detectives discovered tape residue, indicating to them that at some point, the killer had stuck it to her body in order to keep her quiet. Investigators also checked the rest of the home and found Christina Powell downstairs on the living room floor. Like Sonia, she had been purposely posed in a degrading way. Her injuries consisted of 5 stab wounds on her mid-back, all clustered together, also resulting in a punctured lung. She also had a small cut on her wrist and minor bruises on both of her legs. Again, tape residue was found on her body. Authorities made the shocking discovery that Christina's nipples had also been cut off and were seemingly taken from the scene, as they were nowhere to be found. The court documents note that there was a bottle of dish soap and a towel placed between her legs, and that there was a sticky substance on her pubic area. It was evident that the killer had attempted to clean her body, most likely to destroy evidence. Semen was found on a pair of underwear next to Christina's body, as well as on some paper towels that were left in the kitchen. Some sources state that there was a handprint found on the paper towel, one with a missing finger. However, this detail wasn't reported a ton, so I'm unsure if it's true. I did find it to be interesting, though. Scattered throughout the home were several pieces of clothing, many of which had either of the girls' blood on them. The Larson family was quickly informed about the gruesome situation, and they immediately made the drive to Gainesville. Ada, Sonia's mother, later stated, quote, "I had to have my husband stop at the side of the road, and I looked outside, and the stars were shining. I just looked at God, and I said, 'God, why? How could this possibly happen? Why did this happen?'" After leaving the scene, the former chief of police of the Gainesville Police Department, Waylon Clifton, said that all he could think about on the drive home was the terrifying possibility that these would not be the only murders committed by the deranged killer. It was clear that whoever committed this heinous crime enjoyed doing it, which pointed towards the strong likelihood that it would happen again. Soon, his fears came true when they discovered the next chilling murder. Rowling did not wait long to commit his next killing, with this following one, repeatedly described as his worst and most sickening attack. On the night of Saturday, August 25th, just one day after his last murders, Rowling set his sights on 18-year-old Christa Hoyt. Christa wanted to become part of law enforcement, and at the time was a university student who was also working part-time at the Alachua County Sheriff's Office. Her home's owner and manager, Elbert Hoover, last spoke to her on Saturday evening. She then went out of the house and reportedly returned around 10 p.m. When Christa didn't show up for her overnight shift at the station on the 26th, a few officers were sent to check on her. Paired with the fact that it was unlike her to not show up, especially without calling in, The deaths of the two other girls around her age really spooked her co-workers. It was in the early morning hours of August 27th when the officers arrived at her apartment. They began knocking and were actually somewhat relieved when Christa didn't answer the door. To them, it meant she possibly already left for work and was just going to be late. However, that was then that they noticed Christa's car parked nearby, and they knew something must have been wrong. Along with the now concerned manager, Elbert, the officers began to try to get into the home. The front door was locked, so they went around the back, noticing that part of the nearby fence was damaged. When the officers went up to the back door, it was also unable to be opened. They were able to peer into the house under the blinds that weren't pulled all of the way down, but that's when they saw a glimpse of the gruesome scene that awaited them. They immediately called in to get more officers out to the scene. When the investigative team arrived, they entered the home, cautiously clearing it in case the perpetrator was still there. Nothing prepared them for when they approached Christa's bedroom. As they entered, they got a true sense of the horror that she had been put through. On the edge of the bed, they found Christa's decapitated and unclothed body sitting up but leaning forward. Her head was placed on a nearby bookshelf, which had been pulled through her home, as it seemingly originated near the front door. Her head was positioned to overlook her own headless corpse. Next to her body, investigators discovered her nipples, which had been cut off, similar to Christina Powell. But this time, they were left at the scene. When investigators laid her body back, they discovered a massive slash on her torso, all the way from her chest to her pubic bone. Her cause of death was determined to be a 7.5-inch long stab wound to her back, which punctured her aorta and lung. She also apparently had a smaller cut on her right arm. Again, they found evidence of tape residue on Christa, signaling to them that her killer had used duct tape to restrain her, and then removed it before leaving. Around the room, her clothes were scattered, including her bra and underwear. She had also been sexually assaulted, as they found semen DNA inside of her. Of course, Christa's murder was quickly linked to those of Sonia and Christina. The act of decapitation with Christa was obviously new, but authorities couldn't ignore the many other similarities. Rowling later confessed to authorities that after leaving Christa's apartment, he returned because he thought he left his wallet there. It was then that he apparently decided to position Christa on the edge of the bed and decapitate her, placing her head on the bookshelf. According to a detective on the case, it was during the initial investigation at Christa's home that they received a report of a bank robbery taking place nearby, which does come into play. I'll get back to this in just a moment. Christa's father, Gary, had a particularly difficult time dealing with her violent death. His wife, Christa's stepmom, Diana, later said, quote, "My husband would just sit and say, 'Just tell me she died right away. Tell me she did not suffer.' These police officers knew Christa. They told Gary she died right away from the first stab, which was the truth. But there were many hours before that. After both murder scenes were discovered, the news of a serial killer targeting young women in college broke and absolutely terrified the community. Locks and self-defense weapons were being bought at a record high all around the city. The residents were unaware that this killer had already struck again by the time Christa's murder was being investigated. In the early morning hours of Monday, August 27th, Rowling claimed his fourth and fifth victims. 23-year-old Tracy Pauls was on the phone with her friend until nearly 1 a.m., and during their conversation, they actually talked about the recent attacks in the area. Not long after Tracy got off the phone with her friend, her roommate, 23-year-old Manuel Taboada, returned home from work. Between 2 and 3 a.m., someone in the apartment above theirs heard a scream, but after waiting on the balcony and failing to hear anything else, they went back to bed. After entering the home by prying the sliding glass door open, Rowling later stated that he found Manny sleeping in his room and proceeded to stab him in his mid-torso. Manny fought back hard, which Tracy heard from the other room. During this time, Rowling stabbed Manny around 10 more times, but it's reported that he had a total of 31 open wounds by the end of the attack. Tracy left her room to check what was going on, and when she saw Rowling, she sprinted back and attempted to lock herself inside her room. Unfortunately, Rowling broke through the door, and she had nothing to protect herself with. It was in the room that Tracy reportedly asked, quote, "You're the one, aren't you?" To which Rowling replied, quote, "Yeah, I'm the one." Like the other victims, Rowling taped Tracy's hands behind her back and pressed tape over her mouth. He then forcibly undressed her before also sexually assaulting her. After he was finished, he turned her onto her stomach and stabbed her in the back a few times. After ending her life, Rowling dragged her body into the hallway and reportedly wiped blood off of her face with a damp washcloth before sexually assaulting her once again. According to court documents, he also used a cleaner to flush Tracy's body out in an attempt to get rid of evidence. It was the next day, August 28th, when the bodies of Tracy and Manuel were discovered. The friend that had been talking to Tracy before she was murdered alerted another friend to check on them after she was unable to get a hold of her. When he got to the apartment on Tuesday morning, he had a maintenance man open the door to check on the two residents. That was when the scene was finally uncovered and authorities were alerted. Inside of the home, they found Tracy's body in the hallway. Again, tape residue was found on her. They also discovered Manny's lifeless body on his bed, with blood covering the room. After taking a look around the apartment, detectives found that Tracy's bedroom door was damaged and appeared to them like it had been forcibly opened. Blood found on the door was tested and came back as being a match for Manny's blood type. Evidence showed investigators that Tracy had likely been killed in her bed and then moved after her death, as there was a thick trail of blood leading to her body from the bed. Inside her room, authorities found that her killer had taped her curtains closed with duct tape, which had not been removed from the scene. In the kitchen, there were drops of blood in front of the sink, suggesting that the killer had tried to clean himself up a bit. The point of entry was found to have been the apartment's sliding glass door, as investigators noticed pry marks near where the lock would be. The screen had also been pulled off. Tracy's older sister Lori was in Atlanta when she found out about the murders. Along with her husband, they immediately made their way to Florida. Lori said, quote, "I was wishing the plane would crash because I didn't want to continue living." She also later said, quote, "All I want to know is what was she thinking? What fear did she have going through her mind? Was she thinking of me? I can't help it. That's what I'm thinking. But the terror, I can't get past that." On the same day that Tracy and Manny's bodies were found, while investigating the recent bank robbery I talked about a little bit ago, police noticed two suspicious men walking in the woods. After calling for them to stop, only one did. The other one took off, and the police were unable to detain him. The man that stopped claimed that the one who ran away was named Mike. Authorities used dogs to track his scent, which led them to a campsite. There, they found a piece of evidence from the bank robbery, the bag used in the crime, which was stained with red splotches from a dye pack that was placed in the bag by the bank teller. To them, it was obvious that whoever had just gotten away was most likely the one who had robbed the bank earlier. However, the police also found a few other things that piqued their interest. At the same campsite, they came across a screwdriver similar to what the authorities believed was used to pry open the doors in the recent murders. Also at the scene, they recovered a gun, duct tape, and a few pieces of clothing, including a brown ski mask. The fibers from the mask were later found to be consistent with fibers found in the tape residue at all three crime scenes, as well as on the duct tape used to keep Tracy's curtains closed. Also found was a cassette player with a tape still inside of it. For some reason, the tape went completely unlistened to for a while. Though no more bodies were discovered in the days following the 5 gruesome attacks, students were still terrified. They reportedly began leaving the area by the thousands, unsure who was going to be the spree killer's next target. Little did anyone know, the killer had already left Gainesville and was headed south. Police quickly named a suspect for the murders, an 18-year-old man named Ed Humphrey, who had recently been picked up for assaulting his own grandma. Those who knew him said that he had been disappearing a lot lately, and that he had started carrying a knife around. That was enough for investigators to consider him to be a possible suspect. However, there was one problem with this scenario. Through testing the semen DNA found at all 3 scenes, authorities determined that the killer had type B blood. Humphrey's blood type, however, was type A. 10 days after killing his last victims, Rowling was arrested after attempting to rob a supermarket in Ocala, Florida. After fleeing the scene and starting a high-speed car chase, Rowling crashed the vehicle and tried to flee on foot, but was eventually caught and taken into custody. He was nowhere near on the police's radar for the murders, so for the time being, he was only being held for the robbery. It's reported that while Humphrey was in custody, investigators in Florida learned about a cold case that took place in Louisiana about a year prior. As we already know, it was the Grissom family murders. Because of the striking similarities, one of the investigators, a man named Don Maines, went over to Shreveport to take a look at the connections. After all, Julie Grissom had been found in a similar way to the female victims in Gainesville, being left in a degrading position. The manner of deaths were also consistent, with all victims killed due to being stabbed. There was also the fact that Julie had been seemingly cleaned and had tape residue left on her body similar to the women killed in Florida. In late August 1990, not long after the initial connection between the killings was made, a woman named Cindy Jurusik was traveling through Florida when she heard about the 5 college students who were recently murdered. Cindy was from Shreveport, Louisiana, the same city where Rowling had lived for most of his life. After learning about the details of these gruesome killings, Cindy immediately remembered back to 1989, when the Grissom family murders occurred in Shreveport. After all, like we just talked about, there were many similarities. In a wild turn of events, Cindy actually knew Rowling personally, later stating that they attended the same church and that he would often spend time with her and her family. She remembered back in time, a few months after the 3 family members were killed, when Rowling apparently told Cindy's then-husband that he had a serious problem. After she inquired about what the problem was, her husband said, quote, "He likes to stick knives into people." It was in November of 1990 when Cindy, despite not wanting to believe someone she knew could do something so horrific, made a call to authorities to report her suspicions about Rowling. Following this lead, authorities looked into his background and learned of his previous criminal history, including the many armed robberies. Now knowing he had committed these crimes prior, police began to suspect him of the recent bank robbery that took place in Gainesville. That was when they apparently reviewed the items gathered from the campsite and finally listened to the tape left in the cassette player. In the recording, Rowling played guitar, sang his original songs, and also apologized to his parents. He ended the recording with, quote, "Well, I'm gonna sign off for a little bit. I got something I gotta do." It's reported that this sign-off was made just before going on to commit one of the murders. The most important part about this tape, though, is that at one point, he stated his full name, Danny Harold Rowling. When police finally had Rowling in their sights, it didn't take long for them to locate him. Like stated before, he had been arrested after attempting to rob a store and was currently being held 40 miles south of Gainesville in Marion County Jail. Police were obviously looking at him for the bank robbery, but paired with Cindy's hunch and the additional items found at the campsite, they looked into him for the murders as well. They tested Rowling's DNA, and sure enough, his blood type came back as type B, the same type that was found not only in the Gainesville murders, but also in the Grissom family murders. Finally, on November 15, 1991, Rowling was charged with the 5 murders of the college students in Gainesville. However, before the trial started, he was convicted on federal bank robbery charges. While in prison for that, he met an inmate who was on death row, a man named Bobby Lewis. Apparently, Rowling shared information regarding his murders with Lewis, who then wrote a 5-page letter outlining the details. He later stated, quote, "I've never been told nothing in reality. I've never read nothing in a Stephen King novel that comes close to what the reality is of what this man did. In order to confirm his confession, investigators wanted to sit down with Rowling to have a meeting. However, Rowling did not want to talk to authorities alone and insisted that Lewis talk for him. When asked a question, Lewis would give an answer, and Rowling would confirm it if it were correct. It was during this meeting that Rowling first mentioned two dark personalities that manifested within him. He claimed that one was named Enad, which is just his name, Danny spelled backwards, and the other one was named Gemini. According to Rowling, Enad was not evil, but he wasn't a good person either. However, Rowling described Gemini as sinister and blamed him for the most violent acts that he committed. Rowling stated that he had always struggled with the urge to kill, but was able to keep it at bay until recently. Though he openly confessed to the 5 murders in Gainesville, Rowling would not admit to killing the 3 family members back in Shreveport, Louisiana. Rowling's trial for the murders of the 5 students was scheduled for early 1994, more than 3 years after the attacks. On the day it was set to begin, Rowling apparently made the last-minute decision to plead guilty on all counts. Because the death penalty was on the table, the evidence still had to be presented to the jury so that they could make a decision on whether he would be executed or not. His defense team obviously latched on to the extensive abuse he suffered throughout his life at the hands of his father as the reason he went on to kill multiple people in such a vicious way. However, the fact was brought up that many people grow up with abusive parents and don't end up murdering innocent people, including Rowling's own brother, Kevin. The prosecution went after his claims that he was taken over by Gemini when committing the killings. Apparently, Rowling had admitted to watching The Exorcist III in the week leading up to the murders. The former state attorney, Rod Smith, stated that Rowling ripped the idea straight out of the movie, as the main antagonist's name was the Gemini Killer. Rod stated, quote, "He just stole that and used that as part of his story. Danny committed these crimes for one reason only. He loved it." Just a quick interjection that I found interesting is that Rowling actually got engaged to a true crime author while in prison. Her name was Sandra London, and with Rowling's help, she published a book titled The Making of a Serial Killer, the real story of the Gainesville murders in the killer's own words. Again, not super important, but while in court, Rowling sang a song to Sandra, showing his complete disregard for the whole situation.
I recall the day I first saw you. I reached out to say I love you, but it was hard to say. I couldn't touch you. So tell me, baby, what were my words? All my tears run together.
Excuse me, Mr. Rowling.
Down the
Mr.
path
Rowling.
you choose
Mr. Rowling.
to follow.
Mr. Rowling.
Tell me, baby, what were my words? All my tears run together. What were my words? All my tears run together, baby, just like rain.
Okay, you get one song and that's it, Mr. Rowling. We're not here so that you can address your friend. We're here for sentencing.
At the end of the trial, a unanimous decision to put Rowling to death was made. Following the sentence, Manny's brother Mario spoke to Rowling directly, saying, quote, "You're going down in 5. Do you understand that? In less than 5 years. We have the last say. We will prevail. Our children's names will be remembered over him." Unfortunately, Rowling's execution took a lot longer to happen than anyone wanted it to. It wouldn't be until October of 2006, more than 16 years after the attacks in Gainesville, that Rowling was finally put to death by lethal injection. It seems as though right before he died, Rowling met with a pastor and finally admitted to killing the 3 Grissom family members all those years prior via written note. Despite his confession, he was never charged for their murders. Many of the victims' relatives from both the Shreveport and Gainesville murders made it a point to be there to witness Rowling finally perish. Minutes before his life was drained, Rowling reportedly sang a gospel hymn to those there to watch him die. There was no mention of the 8 lives he brutally stole, and of course no remorse in the form of an apology was expressed. Daniel Harold Rowling was finally executed on October 25, 2006. Like stated before, Rowling also confessed to sexually assaulting a woman on his way down to Gainesville, who ended up being Janet Frake. She later said, quote, "I knew it immediately, just by listening to his voice and watching his body language. That's the guy who raped me." Now I want to talk a little bit about each victim. Some were harder to find information on than others, mainly a few of the first victims, as there just isn't as much reported. William Thomas Grissom was 55 years old at the time of his death, and was born on September 2, 1934. He was nearing the time to retire, but sadly, he would never get to. William was said to have been a very polite and respectable man, who, according to ShreveportTimes.com, was battling throat cancer. Though he had been suffering from it for years, he was reportedly on the mend. 24-year-old Julie Ann Grissom was born on April 24, 1965. At the time of her death, Julie was working at the local mall and was attending university at Louisiana State University of Shreveport. She had transferred there earlier in the year of her death from Baton Rouge. Sadly, though she was very close to graduating, that day would never come for her. She was said to have been a sweet girl and was someone who never gave up on what she set out to accomplish. Born on October 24, 1981, Sean Grissom was only 8 years old when he was murdered. Like stated before, he had just celebrated his birthday and was visiting his grandpa and aunt at the time of his death. He was only in 3rd grade. Sonia Jane Larson was 18 years old and was born on January 1, 1972. Growing up, it was said she had a love for kids and wanted to become a teacher. She attended the First Baptist Church, where she enjoyed helping in the daycare. She also played the flute and handbells in the church orchestra. Gail Guyton, the church's director of childhood ministries, described Sonia as the kind of person who never walked into a room, but rather bounced in. She was a very sweet girl, and always made sure to let those around her know that she loved them. Christina Powell was born on November 30, 1972, and was 17 years old when she was killed. She loved rap music, softball, and was super excited to attend the University of Florida, aspiring to become an architect. One of her friends said, quote, "Once Christy decided on University of Florida, she was very enthusiastic. She had a UF bumper sticker on her car, and she was wearing UF t-shirts. She couldn't wait." When Christina moved into her 2-bedroom apartment for college, she quickly wanted to fill the empty room. That's when she met Sonia Larson, and she moved in. 18-year-old Christa Lee Hoyt was born on November 20, 1971, and grew up in the small city of Archer in Alachua County, Florida. All throughout her life, Christa excelled in school, always focusing on her grades. She attended Newberry High School, where she was a part of the school's academic team, eventually graduating with honors. Like stated before, Christa aspired to become a part of law enforcement and was propelling herself into that dream by working part-time at her local sheriff's office. Manuel Ricardo Taboada was 23 years old at the time of his death and was born on September 14, 1966. Manny was described as a very hard-working man who persevered through anything. His father passed away when he was a teenager, but Manny found a way to get through the loss and excel. He graduated high school with honors and dreamed of becoming an architect. Manny was active and loved to hang out with friends. One of his neighbors recalled these traits. Quote, "He would offer to make drinks and bring them down to us. He'd always be the first to suggest doing something, going out, going to a party. He just had so much drive to him." Tracy Inez Pauls was born on October 4, 1966, making her 23 years old when she was murdered. At the time, she was in school and aspired to become a lawyer. She and her older sister Lori got along great during their whole lives and spent a lot of time together. Now being in college, Tracy would go back home and spend every summer with her sister. Lori used a name for her first child that Tracy helped her pick out before her death. She wishes more than anything that Tracy would have been able to meet her children, but Lori makes sure that they still know who their Aunt Tracy was. Following the murders in Gainesville, a mural was painted, honoring each of the 5 innocent victims. It's located on a wall which has become an art exhibit in the community. Though paintings usually get covered up over time, it was, for the most part, understood that the section which honors the victims should remain unchanged. Unfortunately, it has seen a lot of vandalism over the years, but those who care for those who lost their lives continue to fix it up. There is another memorial, a median that contains trees with the victims' names posted on them. Thank you all for listening and watching to the end of this video. Please take a moment to remember the 8 victims who tragically lost their lives in such a horrific way. Like stated in the beginning of the video, these murders were so gruesome that they went on to inspire the movie series, Scream. Thank you to all of our members for supporting the channel further. It's very much appreciated. Until next time, please stay safe, and we will see you later.